When police forced the apartment door open in 2002, Layne Staley had already been dead for 14 days. No struggle, no outgoing calls, no note left behind. A man who sold over 30 million albums, who once stood under stage lights before tens of thousands, had disappeared from the world for nearly 5 years, and his absence went unnoticed. The voice that carried an entire generation's pain didn't burn out. It was left alone. So the real question isn't when Layne Staley died. It's when a legend vanished, long before his body stopped breathing. In 1992, Alice in Chains released Dirt. Within months, the album sold millions of copies and would eventually pass 5 million in the United States alone, becoming one of the darkest records ever embraced by the mainstream. Layne Staley didn't hide behind symbolism. On MTV, he didn't smile or perform a persona. He stared straight into the camera and sang about addiction, decay, and self-disgust, without metaphor, without distance. Songs like Junkhead, Down in a Hole, and Wood weren't warnings. They were recorded confessions. Just a year later, Alice in Chains was filling arenas. By 1994, they were opening for Metallica in front of 50,000 people a night. Layne stood at the center of the stage, thin, almost motionless, while tens of thousands screamed back the pain he had once written in isolation. The bigger the success grew, the wider the gap became between the man on stage and the man behind the voice. Then the signs began to surface. Tours were quietly canceled. Interviews were avoided. Appearances became rare, until only one remained. The fragile, haunting MTV Unplugged performance in 1996. That night would be the last time Layne Staley truly faced a world. He didn't collapse in front of cameras. He didn't die on stage. He didn't vanish in a public scandal. He simply stopped stepping outside, while his voice continued to echo everywhere. And as the world kept listening to Layne Staley every day, the man himself was already disappearing. Slowly, completely, until no one noticed he had been gone long before death finally arrived. Layne Staley was born in August 1967 in Kirkland, Washington, a quiet suburb that looked stable from the outside but felt fragile from within. His parents divorced when he was young, and the separation left a mark that never fully healed. The house grew quieter. The sense of security thinned out. For a child already sensitive to emotional shifts, absence became the first lesson. People could disappear without warning, and love could leave without explanation. In his early years, Layne was described as gentle, polite, and unusually perceptive. He paid attention to moods, to silences, to what adults did not say out loud. This sensitivity made him empathetic, but it also made him vulnerable. He absorbed tension easily and carried it inward, learning early that showing pain did not make it go away. It only made it visible. So he learned to hold it in. Music arrived as both refuge and identity. At first, it wasn't about fame or expression. It was about control. Sound was something he could shape when the rest of his world felt unstable. Layne started with drums before moving toward vocals, discovering that his voice could carry emotion in a way nothing else could. Singing didn't solve his problems, but it gave them a place to exist. Pain finally had a shape. Loneliness had a sound. As a teenager, Layne began experimenting with different versions of himself. He briefly adopted the surname of his stepfather, a small but telling gesture. It wasn't rebellion. It was an attempt to belong, to anchor himself to something that felt solid. When that stability failed to hold, the name changed back, but the impulse remained. Layne was always searching for a version of himself that felt permanent. Friends from that period often described him as warm and funny, but guarded. He could connect deeply, then pull away just as fast. Relationships mattered to him intensely, sometimes dangerously so. He didn't love halfway. When he attached completely. And when that bond was threatened, the emotional fallout was overwhelming. This pattern, total connection followed by profound loss, would repeat itself throughout his life. By his late teens, Seattle's underground music scene was beginning to take shape. It was a city filled with distortion, anger, and introspection. Layne fit into it naturally, not because he wanted to be seen, but because he already felt everything the music was trying to express. Where others used darkness as an aesthetic, Layne lived inside it. The songs he gravitated toward weren't about escape. They were about recognition. What mattered most is that none of this felt dramatic at the time. There was no single traumatic event that explained everything. No clear origin story for addiction or collapse. Just a slow accumulation of emotional weight, carried quietly year after year. A child learning to self-soothe. A teenager learning to disappear emotionally when things hurt too much. A young adult learning that intimacy could feel like oxygen and its absence like suffocation. Long before drugs entered the picture, Layne had already learned how to numb himself. He learned how to sit with pain without asking for help. He learned how to perform strength while feeling hollow inside. Music didn't create this pattern. It amplified it. It gave his inner world a microphone, but it didn't teach him how to protect himself from what came out. This foundation is essential to understanding everything that followed. Layne Staley did not fall from grace because of sudden excess or reckless fame. He carried his wounds into success, untreated and unresolved. The stages got bigger. The crowds grew louder. But the emotional blueprint remained the same. A man who felt too much, trusted too deeply, and never learned how to leave pain behind. So before the records, before the tours, before the addiction became visible, the trajectory was already forming. The question isn't why Layne Staley struggled once the spotlight hit. The real question is this: how much pain can someone learn to carry in silence before it starts looking for a way out? By the late 1980s, Layne Staley wasn't chasing success. He was chasing alignment. He moved through Seattle's growing underground scene not as a strategist, but as someone tried to find a place where his inner world made sense. This wasn't a city built on polish or ambition. It was wet, gray, inward-looking, and restless. The music that emerged from it wasn't designed to escape pain. It was designed to sit inside it, and that made it feel honest to him. Before Alice in Chains had a name, Layne was already experimenting with identity through sound. Early projects leaned toward glam and metal influences, but even then, something felt off. The surface was loud, but the core didn't fit yet. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in weight. He wanted music that felt heavy emotionally, not just sonically. That tension pushed him forward, away from trends and toward something darker and slower. The turning point came when he met Jerry Cantrell. Their connection wasn't instant chemistry, in the romantic sense often told in rock mythology. It was functional, almost quiet. Jerry brought structure, riffs, and discipline. Layne brought vulnerability, rawness, and a voice that didn't sound like it was trying to impress anyone. Together, they created contrast, and contrast became the band's signature. Where Jerry wrote controlled, grinding guitar lines, Layne sang like someone confessing under pressure. Alice in Chains formed in a space between metal and something more exposed. They didn't belong fully to the glam scene, and they didn't sound like punk either. Their music felt slower, heavier, and emotionally claustrophobic. Layne's lyrics were direct to the point of discomfort. He didn't wrap pain in metaphor. He named it: addiction, shame, isolation, self-contempt. These weren't themes he adopted. They were states he already lived in. As the band started gaining attention, Layne's role became clearer. He wasn't just a frontman. He was the emotional center of gravity. Audiences didn't just listen to him. They leaned toward him. There was something unsettling about how little distance he kept between himself and the material. Other singers performed darkness. Layne inhabited it. That authenticity made the music hit harder. But it also erased boundaries that might have protected him later. Early success didn't arrive as validation. It arrived as exposure. Suddenly, the most private parts of Layne's inner life were being amplified through speakers, reviewed in magazines, and shouted back by strangers. For someone who had already struggled with emotional containment, this was dangerous territory. The line between expression and self-extraction began to blur. Writing songs stopped being a release and started becoming a repetition. At the same time, Layne was still forming his adult identity. He was young, emotionally porous, and deeply relational. He attached strongly to people and environments that made him feel seen, even temporarily. The band became both a refuge and a mirror. It gave him purpose, but also locked him into a role. The man who could articulate pain better than anyone else. The more convincingly he did that, the more the world expected him to keep doing it. This period wasn't marked by chaos yet. There were no public collapses, no tabloid stories, just a gradual narrowing of options. The music got heavier, the lyrics got closer to the bone, and Layne, almost without noticing, began walking down a path that didn't allow much room to turn around. He wasn't choosing destruction. He was choosing honesty, again and again, without realizing the cost. By the time Alice in Chains signed their first major deal and stepped onto larger stages, Layne Staley had already committed to a way of creating that required him to bleed a little every time. It worked. The world responded. But something fundamental was missing. There was no separation between the man and the message. No protective layer. Just a voice carrying everything he had learned to keep inside since childhood. So when success finally arrived, it didn't change Layne's direction. It accelerated it. He had found his path, and it felt true. The question that remained unanswered was whether a person can survive when their entire identity is built on turning inner pain into public sound and never learning when to stop. By the early 1990s, Alice in Chains wasn't rising quietly. They were cutting through the noise of a crowded scene and pulling the spotlight toward something heavier, slower, and more uncomfortable. Seattle had become the center of a cultural shift, and while other bands were framed as spokesmen for a generation, Layne Staley never claimed that role. It was placed on him anyway. His voice didn't rally people. It exposed them. The success came fast. Records sold in the millions. Singles rotated constantly on MTV. The band moved from clubs to theaters, from theaters to arenas. Layne stood under brighter lights than he had ever known, but nothing about his presence suggested celebration. He didn't work the crowd. He didn't perform confidence. He held the microphone close and delivered lyrics like admissions, sometimes barely moving, as if motion itself required energy he didn't have to spare. What made Layne magnetic at the peak of his fame was the absence of distance. Most rock frontmen project power. Layne projected vulnerability, unfiltered and unresolved. He sang about addiction while audiences danced to it. He described shame while critics praised the honesty. The contradiction was everywhere. His pain was becoming entertainment. And the more truthful it sounded, the more valuable it became. By 1993, Alice in Chains was no longer just part of the grunge movement. They were one of its pillars. Touring schedules intensified. Expectations grew. Each album was anticipated not just as music, but as another glimpse into Layne's inner collapse. The industry rewarded this transparency without offering protection. There was no pause built into the machine. No mechanism to ask whether the person at the center could sustain this level of exposure. On stage, Layne delivered exactly what people came for. Off stage, the weight accumulated. Fame didn't solve the emptiness he carried from childhood. It amplified it. Applause didn't translate into connection. If anything, it widened the gap. Thousands of people felt they knew him intimately, while he felt increasingly unreachable even to those closest to him. The more his voice filled rooms, the more isolated he became once the lights went out. There was also pressure to remain consistent, not musically, but emotionally. Audiences expected darkness. Critics expected confession. The band's identity was built around a specific emotional gravity, and Layne was its core. Stepping away from that would have felt like betrayal, not just to fans, but to the version of himself that believed pain was his only truth. Happiness had no place in the narrative. Healing didn't fit the sound. As the tours continued, signs of strain became harder to ignore. Layne's physical appearance changed. His presence became unpredictable. There were nights when he looked distant, almost detached from performance unfolding around him, but the crowd still roared. The show still sold out. The industry kept moving forward, interpreting endurance as strength and silence as consent. In this period, Layne Staley became an icon not because he conquered his demons, but because he refused to disguise them. That refusal was celebrated as bravery. But bravery without boundaries is dangerous. Every performance required him to reopen wounds that never had time to close. Every interview reduced his inner life to sound bites. Every photo froze him in a moment he had already outgrown emotionally. The spotlight did not feel like validation. It felt like surveillance. Fame asked him to stay visible while he was already retreating inward. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began pulling back, not dramatically, Not defiantly, just enough to breathe, just enough to survive the next show. The cancellations hadn't started yet, but the distance was forming. At the height of his career, Layne Staley had everything the outside world associates with success: money, influence, a voice recognized instantly by millions. What he lacked was a private space where that voice could rest. The stage had become both his platform and his trap, rewarding honesty while consuming the person behind it. So when people look back and ask how someone so celebrated could slip away unnoticed, they missed a more important question. At the very moment Layne Staley reached the peak of visibility, was he already beginning to disappear? And did anyone know how to see the difference? Layne Staley's collapse didn't begin with excess. It began with attachment. Long before addiction became visible, he had already learned to tie a sense of safety to other people. When connection felt real, it felt essential. When it disappeared, the emptiness wasn't emotional, it was physical. By the early 1990s, that pattern had quietly locked into place, waiting for the right conditions to turn destructive. Those conditions arrived alongside fame. Touring magnified isolation. Hotel rooms replaced homes. Nights blurred together. The band moved constantly, while Layne's inner world stayed stuck on the same unresolved questions. He didn't use substances to escape pleasure. He used them to regulate pain, to quiet anxiety, to slow thoughts that never rested. What began as relief slowly became structure, something reliable in a life that no longer felt anchored. Addiction, in Layne's case, wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. It followed routine. It filled gaps left by emotional absence. As his reliance deepened, so did his secrecy. He became skilled at compartmentalizing, functional on stage, withdrawn off it. The voice remained powerful. The lyrics stayed sharp. From the outside, it looked like endurance. From the inside, it was erosion. Relationships suffered first. Layne loved intensely, but he also depended intensely. When bonds fractured, the fallout was severe. Loss didn't feel like disappointment. It felt like annihilation. Each emotional break reinforced the same lesson he had learned as a child. People leave and the pain stays. Substances didn't create this belief. They reinforced it by offering predictable numbness in place of unpredictable intimacy. As the years passed, concern grew among those closest to him. Bandmates noticed changes in his availability, his focus, his health. Conversations became cautious. Boundaries blurred between support and enablement. The music industry wasn't equipped to intervene. Success was still flowing. Shows still sold. Albums still charted. As long as the output continued, the system interpreted silence as consent. Physically, the toll became impossible to hide. Weight loss, infections, fatigue. Layne's body was sending warnings long before headlines did, but he resisted treatment that felt invasive or controlling. Control mattered to him. Even self-destruction felt preferable to surrendering autonomy. Accepting help meant admitting vulnerability without the buffer performance, and that felt more dangerous than the damage he was already doing. Publicly, the narrative stayed vague. Rumors circulated, but nothing definitive. Layne avoided interviews, avoided appearances that weren't essential. Each withdrawal reduced exposure, but it also reduced connection. The less he was seen, the easier it became to disappear. The band adjusted. Schedules shifted. Cancellations were explained quietly. The world kept moving, assuming this was temporary. Internally, the distance widened. Layne wasn't unaware of what was happening to him. He felt it daily. But awareness didn't translate into action. Shame layered on top of dependence, creating paralysis. Reaching out felt like burdening others. Staying silent felt familiar. Addiction thrived in that silence, growing stronger as accountability weakened. This was the most dangerous phase, not because it was loud, but because it was controlled. Layne wasn't spiraling publicly. He was managing decline privately. Each day became smaller. Each choice narrowed options further. The stage still existed, but it felt farther away. The voice still lived inside him, but his body was beginning to fail it. By the mid-1990s, the collapse was no longer theoretical. It was structural. The foundation that once supported his art was cracking under the weight of untreated pain, dependency, and isolation. And yet, to the outside world, Layne Staley was still a legend in motion, still alive, still present in sound. What no one could see was how close the system was to shutting down, and how little room remained to pull him back once it did. In April 1996, Alice in Chains walked onto the stage of MTV Unplugged. For the audience, it was a comeback. For Layne Staley, it was something closer to a farewell. He appeared visibly fragile, his body thin, his movements careful as a conserving energy. Yet when he sang, the voice was still there, not polished, not healed, but devastatingly intact. Every note carried the weight of someone holding themselves together in real time. That performance became iconic, not because it was triumphant, but because it felt terminal. Layne didn't try to reassure anyone. He didn't promise recovery. He didn't frame the night as a turning point. He simply showed up, sang the songs, and retreated again. In retrospect, Unplugged wasn't a revival. It was a moment of clarity, the last time the world saw him without distance, before he disappeared almost completely. After that night, Layne Staley withdrew from public life with a finality that startled even those closest to him. He stopped touring. He stopped giving interviews. He stopped answering calls. Seattle, once a place of community and sound, narrowed down to a single apartment. Days blended into nights. Contact became sporadic, then rare, then non-existent. His absence wasn't announced. It simply settled in. Friends tried to reach him. Bandmates checked in when they could. But Layne had built walls quietly and thoroughly. Isolation wasn't a dramatic choice. It was a gradual tightening of boundaries, a way to keep the world from asking questions he couldn't answer. The fewer people he saw, the fewer expectations he had to meet. The smaller his world became, the safer it felt, at least on the surface. Physically, the decline accelerated. Years of dependence had weakened his immune system. Infections became frequent. Pain became constant. But even then, Layne resisted intervention. Hospitals represented loss of control. Rehabilitation meant exposure. To accept help required admitting how far things had gone, and shame made that impossible. It was easier to disappear than to be seen in that state. Meanwhile, the band moved forward without him. Music was released. Statements were made carefully, respectfully, without details. Fans speculated endlessly. Some believed Layne was recovering in private. Others assumed he would return when ready. The truth was far quieter. He wasn't preparing a comeback. He wasn't planning a return. He was surviving day to day, cut off from momentum that once defined him. What makes this period especially haunting is how little drama surrounded it. No paparazzi photos, no public meltdowns, no final interviews, just silence in a culture that expects destruction to be loud. Layne's collapse was almost invisible. The world learned to live without seeing him, even while his voice continued to circulate endlessly through radios, playlists, and memories. As the years passed, the gap between the legend and the man grew wider. Layne Staley became an idea preserved in recordings, while the human being faded behind closed doors. He didn't chase oblivion. He drifted into it, slowly, carefully, without witnesses. By the time concern turned into alarm, there was no clear path back. This wasn't a story of sudden tragedy. It was a long erosion, marked by one final appearance and an extended disappearance. MTV Unplugged stands now as the last documented moment where both sides of Layne Staley exist in the same space. The artist still capable of reaching millions, and the man already retreating from everything that required him to stay. When the world thinks of Layne Staley's collapse, it often focuses on how it ended, but the more unsettling truth is how long it took and how quietly it happened. Because long before the apartment door was opened, long before the final number was counted, Layne Staley had already been living in near total silence, unseen, unheard, and slowly slipping away from the world that still believed he was simply taking time off. There was no dramatic comeback arc waiting for Layne Staley, no rehab announcement, no press conference promising change. If there was a turning point at all, it was quiet and internal, marked not by progress but by pause. The world expected a rebound. Layne chose something closer to withdrawal. And in that choice, the meaning of rebirth shifted into something far less cinematic. After MTV Unplugged, the industry treated Layne's absence as temporary. Artists disappear all the time, especially after success. The assumption was that rest would restore him, That distance would heal what exposure had damaged. But Layne wasn't resting. He was disconnecting. The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to imagine stepping back into a world that demanded explanation, accountability, and visibility. There were moments when he seemed to hover at the edge of return. Brief recording sessions, occasional communication, small signs that the voice was still there, waiting, but each attempt carried weight. To reappear meant confronting time lost, expectations unmet, and a version of himself frozen in the public imagination. The gap between who he had been and who he was becoming felt impossible to bridge. Rebirth, in Layne's case, did not mean recovery in traditional sense. It meant choosing not to perform survival. He wasn't interested in redemption narratives. He didn't frame his pain as a lesson or his absence as transformation. The closest thing to renewal he allowed himself was privacy, control over how little of the world could access. In a life defined by exposure, retreat became the only remaining form of agency. This period also reframed his relationship with music. Singing had once been instinctive, unavoidable. Now it carried consequence. Every lyric echoed too close to reality. Recording meant reopening wounds without the buffer of momentum or crowds. The voice still worked, but the cost of using it had grown too high. Silence became protective, even as it deepened isolation. Those around him struggled to interpret this phase. Was he giving up or holding on? Was this collapse or resistance? The truth likely sat somewhere in between. Layne wasn't moving toward death deliberately. He also wasn't moving back toward life as it had been. He occupied a narrow middle space, suspended between what he had lost and what he could no longer tolerate. Time passed differently there. Days had no markers. Years blurred. The music industry kept cycling forward, generating new stars, new tragedies, new stories. Layne became increasingly out of sync with it all. The further removed he was, the less sense return made. Rebirth requires an entry point. Layne had closed most of his, and yet something remained intact. Not hope in the conventional sense, but awareness. He knew what had happened to him. He understood the damage. He felt the distance between the world's version of Layne Staley and the man living quietly behind a locked door. That awareness didn't save him, but it prevented denial. He wasn't pretending things were fine. He simply chose not to narrate his struggle for public consumption. This reframing matters. Layne Staley's story is often reduced to addiction and absence, as if his later years contain no agency at all. But retreat can be a decision, even when it leads somewhere dark. In stepping away, he rejected the expectation that suffering must be productive, that pain must be shared to have value. His rebirth, if it existed, was not a return to the stage. It was a refusal to continue performing his wounds. That refusal confused the world. Fans waited. The band waited. The industry waited. But Layne did not reemerge to meet those expectations. Instead, he remained in that suspended state, living quietly, almost invisibly, while his past continued to speak loudly for him. So when people ask when Layne Staley's life truly changed direction, the answer isn't tied to a specific date or event. It happened the years after the spotlight dimmed, when he chose absence over explanation, silence over spectacle. The question left behind is not whether he could come back, but whether the version of life waiting for him was one he could survive returning to. In the years after Layne Staley withdrew from public life, time seemed to lose its shape. There were no milestones to mark progress, no visible chapters to follow. He lived quietly, almost entirely out of sight, in a small Seattle apartment that became both refuge and boundary. To the outside world, he was on hiatus. To those who understood the situation more closely, he was gone without leaving. His days narrowed. The distance between him and the world grew not through a single decision, but through repetition. Fewer calls answered, fewer doors opened, fewer reasons to step outside. This wasn't a life of chaos or spectacle. It was a life of stillness, a slow contraction, the kind of existence that doesn't trigger alarms until it has already become irreversible. Physically, Layne continued to decline. Years of dependence and isolation took a cumulative toll. His immune system weakened. Infections lingered. Energy faded. But even as his body failed him, his identity as an artist remained frozen in time. To fans, Layne Staley still existed in recordings from the early 1990s. Powerful, raw, unforgettable. The man living behind closed doors bore little resemblance to that image, and the gap between the two only widened. What's striking is how little narrative surrounded these final years. No memoirs, no interviews reclaiming his story, no attempt to reframe his absence as wisdom or growth. Layne didn't seek to control how he would be remembered. He didn't curate a legacy. He allowed the work to speak, even as he receded from it. In a culture obsessed with self-definition, that silence stands out. When Layne Staley died in April 2002, the shock wasn't in the cause. It was in the delay. He had been gone for days before anyone noticed. The world learned all at once that one of the most recognizable voices in modern rock had been living and dying, almost completely alone. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Millions of records sold, endless influence cited, and yet no one at the door. In death, Layne's legacy solidified in a way his life never allowed. His voice became a reference point for emotional honesty in music. Artists across genres pointed to him as proof that vulnerability could be powerful, that darkness didn't need polish to resonate. Songs he wrote decades earlier found new audiences, not because they were nostalgic, but because they still felt uncomfortably current. What Layne left behind wasn't a catalog of excess or controversy. It was a body of work that refused to lie. He sang about addiction while living inside it. He named despair without offering solutions. He didn't pretend pain was temporary or instructive. That refusal to soften reality is why his music endures. It doesn't comfort. It recognizes. At the same time, his story forces an uncomfortable reckoning. What does it mean when a culture rewards honesty but offers no protection for those who provide it? Layne Staley wasn't destroyed by fame alone or by substances alone. He was worn down by a system that consumed his openness without knowing how to respond to it once it became inconvenient. Today, Layne exists in two parallel forms. There's a legend, immortalized in sound, endlessly replayed, permanently intense. And there's the man, fragile, private, increasingly invisible. His legacy lives in the tension between those two realities, in the knowledge that truth-telling can be transformative, but also costly, especially when it becomes someone's entire identity. Layne Staley didn't leave behind answers. He left behind evidence. Evidence of what happens when pain is turned into art without a place to rest afterward. Evidence that silence can be just as expressive as sound. And evidence that even voices that define generations can fade into isolation if no one is prepared to listen once the music stops. In the end, his legacy isn't just about how deeply he sang. It's about how much he carried alone, and how long the world continued to listen to his voice without noticing the man had already disappeared. Layne Staley's story doesn't end with a lesson. There is no clean moral to extract, no redemption to point at, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. What remains is something far less comfortable. A man who told the truth too early, too directly and too completely, and paid for it in isolation. He wasn't destroyed because he lied about who he was. He was destroyed because he didn't. He sang about addiction while still inside it. He described emptiness without pretending it would pass. And the world applauded that honesty, replayed it endlessly, and then quietly stepped back when the person behind it could no longer stand upright. Layne Staley didn't disappear in one night. He faded in plain sight, slowly, politely, without demanding attention. His silence wasn't mysterious. It was cumulative. Years of pain spoken out loud, without anyone knowing what to do once the words stopped. In the end, the tragedy isn't only that Layne died alone. It's that he lived unseen for so long before that moment. While his voice filled rooms, headphones, and generations, the man himself was learning how to vanish without resistance. His story forces an uncomfortable question to linger after the music ends. If someone gives you their pain honestly, without metaphor, without distance, are you prepared to hear beyond the song? Or do we only listen when the suffering sounds beautiful and look away when it becomes real? Layne Staley left behind no instructions on how to survive, only a reminder of what happens when truth is consumed faster than care, and silence becomes the last place left to hide.